Evening, thank you. Was that
Yeah.
right? Okay, so I'm going to talk about my, I guess, almost the major lifelong interest of mine is really the relationship between science and metaphysics. I will then present two very broad metaphysical views with a few things going on around that. One being the one that I call deliberately abusively the billiard ball world, and the true one, which is what I call the world in flux. I'll then, the world in flux underlines what I call process biology that I've been interested in and working on for quite a few years. And I'll talk about, so I'll try and give some sense of why I think this might matter. So this metaphysics has some implications, and then I'll just summarize with a few sentences. Okay, so part one. So, a lot of philosophers of science are a little bit suspicious of metaphysics, and I think that some of this is because metaphysics gets a bad name mainly from metaphysicians, and I didn't want to kind of go into too detailed a view of what metaphysicians think, but so I went, as one does, to Wikipedia, that says metaphysical study is conducted using deduction from that which is known a priori. And I think there are quite a few metaphysicians who would agree with this, though I'm sure that they would say it was crude or oversimplified, or didn't exactly say what they thought. But it seems to me not a bad description of what a lot of metaphysics is. But what I suggest is that properly understood, by which I mean metaphysical study is conducted using multiple methods based on that which is known a posteriori, i.e. broadly speaking science, though of course common sense has a place too, is essential for science. And the idea is that science and metaphysics should be mutually informing. In some moods I say they are dialectically related, but those of you who are not too Hegelian, I won't say that again. Okay, so metaphysics matters, and I have a famous quote. I should give credit here to Dan Nicholson, who finds most of my best quotes. He said, and this is Joseph Henry Wooger, a much maligned philosopher of biology in the middle 20th century, said, metaphysics can be ignored but not escaped. Physiologists and philosophers, that's my addition, who suppose themselves to be above metaphysics are only a very little above it, being up to the neck in it, which seems to me summarizes pretty much my view of the subject. So, what do I mean by metaphysics? So I said it's not, I don't think of it as a priori, I think of it as a posteriori, that's to say, in some sense, grounded in science. So the question obviously arises, well, is metaphysics just a bit of science? And this is a view that some people will hold. Sometimes the view is that it's just armchair science. It's a kind of science you do, but without having actually any empirical information other than what you dredge up from somewhere inside your head. That seems to me not really, as I guess, still a priori. I don't know where a priori knowledge comes from if it's not inside your head. So I don't really like that answer. I think the answer is simply, and it is a very unexciting answer, but perhaps the true one, is just that metaphysics is more abstract and general. So scientific inquiry then, I say, is informed by these sort of abstract general pictures that metaphysics attempts to construct, and it may then it may in turn be refined or changed by empirical results. In a sense, the big picture here is that I think our metaphysics should have been, and in some people's minds has been, drastically changed by the way science has developed over the last few centuries. So a metaphysical which also can be used to interrogate discordant parts of reality, or failing that, discordant parts of reality can be used to question a metaphysical big picture. So the idea is that we aim for some kind of compatibility, at least, between the big picture we have of what the world is we're investigating in science and the detailed account that science offers us of this. So here's just a very quick example to, there was a picture of Hume in the top right-hand corner of the picture once, but I expect you mostly know what Hume looks like. So this is just very quick. I'm not going to say anything interesting about causation. It's just a kind of account of a metaphysical issue that historically, and many of you I'm sure will be very familiar with this. Hume has a famous account of causation as regularity, and a lot of other bits to it that I won't go into. But I say based, defended on the basis of his experience of, for example, billiard balls, or what happens if you leave a bunch of money at Charing Cross Station. As he says, universally, as a law of nature, pretty much, it will disappear. So the idea then, which becomes much more refined in the work, say, of J.S. Mill, 100 years later, where he was a famous kind of rules for inquiry that, again, many will be familiar with, based on the idea of causes being complex, multiple causes being necessary to find the regularities we're interested in. And 100 years later, again, with J.L. Mackie, who gives a very sophisticated account of the sort of regularities we experience in everyday life. I think often, as one goes further down, as people assume that science provides us with regularities, so one tends to focus on this kind of everyday experience in this tradition. If we had a picture of Hume, I would have remarked on the extent to which philosophers seem to have become more colorless over the ages, but it doesn't really work anymore. So this just, and the point I want to make from this is that though this is a classic bit of philosophy, underlying it is actually metaphysics. And metaphysics is, broadly speaking, determinism and the universal rule of law. Again, this is very simplified, but I think what we have here is a view that informs our a metaphysical view, a view of what causation is, informed by an underlying picture, which is somewhere deep down underneath our experience, our universal laws that we hope eventually to explain as science, explain this experience as science progresses. Now, I would say this is an assumption that's come under increasing pressure from empirical science. And just a few things, quantum mechanics obviously doesn't seem to work like that. We increasingly use statistical methods, which seem to suggest a lack of this kind of regularity, though, of course, as the tradition has developed, statistical methods have often been understood in terms, for example, as reflecting our ignorance of the true universal regularities and so on, but also mathematical observations like the indefinite sensitivity of the outcome of certain mathematical functions supposed to apply to the world, to initial conditions, and so on. And as I will argue a bit later on, this is increasingly clearly inappropriate to the life sciences. So, and just to give a sense of where the kind of empirical basis for our metaphysics has perhaps gone wrong, I love this quote from Elizabeth Anscombe, who, and if I need to read it out, basically just saying that a lot of our metaphysics has gone horribly wrong because we were so impressed at the beginning of modern science by the extraordinary regularities of the solar system, which, she says, was just a lucky accident. It just so happened to be a system that was very stable and hadn't been perturbed for a long time. And I don't know how many science fiction readers there are in the room, but for those of you who do read this, there's a wonderful book, or actually it's part of a wonderful trilogy by the Chinese author Cixin Liu, I'm sure I mispronounced, where one of the ideas he explores is life on a planet that actually turns out to have 3 stars revolving around. It's revolving, I can't actually remember the details, but essentially it is in the gravitational influence of 3 stars. And so if the 3-body problem has not been solved, there is in principle no way to predict day length, seasons, or any of the things we take for granted in our orderly solar system. And it's this nice thought experiment. If we lived on such a world, what kind of metaphysics we have? And I suspect it would not be a metaphysics of universal regularity. Okay. So what I'm going to do, and this is basically, this was part 1, but what I want to do from now on is present, first of all, a kind of expansive thesis about what science is doing, what it's telling us, and then an equally ambitious and overarching thesis in metaphysics, and explore the relation between the two. So now the billiard ball world, which as I said is intended to be an abusive description. So here's a nice picture I found online of the billiard ball world, and this is as this clockwork universe. It's often associated with the French mathematician and scientist Laplace. Basically, God, or maybe now we say nature, set up a bunch of initial conditions, Big Bang, and everything, all these billiard balls set off on their ways, bumped into one another, and remarkably, they did so in a way which produced all kinds of interesting results and effects, like us, and life generally, and so on, and solar systems, all kinds of good stuff. And of course, nobody nowadays thinks the world is actually made of little tiny billiard balls, but what I want to suggest is that much of this general picture remains extremely influential in the way people think about the world in metaphysics. So, just quickly describe the sort of things that I think are characteristic and still often believed. So everything happens in accordance with a law of nature, or perhaps several laws of nature that can be put together in sort of deterministic ways. Physics, I'm thinking here, obviously many bits of physics, of the science of the very smallest elements of the world is deterministic and complete. Now, of course, the deterministic bit has become complicated and is one of the ways that the picture has changed. But at any rate, one consequence of this completeness of physics is that whatever happens at higher levels, and again here I tend to think of biology, is either reducible to physics or, in terms of kind of generalizations we try and make about it, strictly speaking, false. At best, approximations to the extent that it's approximately derivable from something that physicists will eventually find, or have already found, to be true. Now, the world is, in the metaphysics of billiard balls, is exhaustively filled with physical things. First of all, these tiniest things, which are, and these are crucial features, I think, independent of one another, essentially. There could just be one of them, and it turns out there are rather a lot. They have distinct boundaries, and they are stable in the sense that when they change, that's the sort of thing we have to try and explain, because left to their own devices, they are stable. And the larger things, from atoms to galaxies, with us somewhere in between, are composed of these smaller things. And these larger things we also think of as, when we've correctly identified them as being independent of one another, existing autonomously. Again, sort of thought experiment. There could be a universe with just me in it and nothing else. That's in principle. I mean, that's sort of so obviously false that it's hard to know exactly what to make of it. But it's sort of, metaphysically possible. independent, they're bounded, I have definite boundaries. There's a point where I stop and the rest of the world begins. And by default, these things are stable. That's to say, what we're interested in explaining in doing science is why things change. Okay, so now, and this, I introduced this just in case you're thinking, nobody really thinks this way, do they? And an example, a philosophical, a famous sort of philosophical thesis or set of arguments that I think shows that they do, at least philosophers think this they do think this way, is Jaegwon Kim, the recently late Jaegwon Kim, I think, famous exclusion principle. And basically what he says is an argument that has been formulated many times, but I think he spent most of a lifetime kind of exploring this idea, is that if you have some kind of complete physics underlying the world, then whenever we do the science or talk about anything at a higher level, ultimately, either we're saying something that's not strictly true, or we are, in principle, could reduce this talk to talk from physics. So causation, and there's a famous sort of diagram you hear, so because it's often discussed in terms of the physical and the mental. So we have a physical state of somebody at one time, and another physical state, generally thought to be their brains, which is supposed to underlie some mental change that happens. Somebody perceives something, has a thought, whatever. This causes a change in the state. Physically, something is happening, and we have to ask how the mental changes that are happening relate to that. And the main point is this can't be just autonomous from the physical state, because if it were, then there had to be some other physical changes happening to somehow explain the differences. I mean, and I don't know, I haven't explained this very well. I hope the idea, it's partly because I think the idea is pretty obvious, right? I mean, if everything that happens is the unfolding of physical laws at the level of the physics, i.e. where all the particles are, then if you try and understand how the particles are changing in your brain by talking about, you know, neurophysiology or something like that, this has got to be compatible with the story that explains in physical terms how all those particles moved around your brain. And to be compatible is, if not in principle, reducible, because you know, it may be impossible for technical reasons to do that derivation, at least depends on it in some, you know, important way. And many of you have heard discussions of supervenience, which is a story about how that dependency might work. And this is not a funny kind of eccentric person doing some strange philosophy out somewhere. This is a very famous, renowned philosopher, and the exclusion principle, if you just search for that, Kim exclusion principle, you can find about 1,000 items on Google Scholar, which include this as a keyword. So this is something that people think is a real problem and a real interesting argument to talk about. Now, so there's some problem that arises in this world for the relation between sciences at higher levels and sciences at the physical level. And for a long time, when I started doing this sort of thing, people assumed that in principle, everything could be explained in terms of physics. You just had to do some very complicated translation between physics and, let's say, neurophysiology. I think this isn't widely believed now, and partly because a lot of people, and I count myself as having made a contribution to this, have said this just makes no sense in terms of what science actually does. Science is not in the business of finding these kinds of reductions. And a number of people in the 80s, 90s, and a nod to Jerry Fodor, who made an argument like this a bit earlier than anybody else, that this just doesn't fit with any kind of descriptive account of science. So the point I want to make here about this is that I think mostly this was a project in sort of descriptive philosophy of science. And so it was more about methodology, epistemology, was saying, if you look at, say, biology or bits of biology and try and understand what it would be to make sense of these as somehow translatable in some kind of incredibly complex, inaccessible way even to physics, this just doesn't really work. That's not how the world is not divided up in ways that just correlate with the physical by these sciences, even in principle, even, you know, in the mind of God. So, but I think that mostly people were not much bothered with the metaphysical underpinnings. There were, as is, you know, very common among philosophers of science, subsequently much more interested in trying to describe, understand the way science worked, methodology, epistemology, than underlying metaphysics. I would say I've always been interested in the underlying metaphysics, and I did have a sort of metaphysical view when I was writing about this stuff, but probably not a very sophisticated one as I now see it. So at that time I think I was engaged in sort of critique of the billiard ball world, and in particular with determinism and causal completeness, with reductionism, which, as I say, arguably follows from this, and also less obvious relevance to what I'll talk about now, essentialism, the idea that, and in particular, I was then interested in the thought that if you looked at the categories of higher level sciences and reductionism were true, there would have to be some kind of links between these and the physical. And actually, the closer you look at these categories, the less plausible it is that they are even the most complex, covert physical categories. So I'm not going to go through this now. I'm not going to explain any of these arguments. This is anyhow ancient stuff. This is book from 1993, but I will just this is actually a little elaboration on that. The completeness of physics is a doctrine that I'm not going to try and discuss. I'm not sure I'm exactly competent to discuss it because obviously, in a way, as a naturalistic philosopher of science, this is something that people who understand string theory and whatever else should be doing. But I just make some very elementary remarks that physics, this kind of physics happens in labs. These are extraordinary places. Experiments in physics labs address very small isolated systems. I mean, obviously, that cyclotron may be quite big, but the sort of conclusions tend to be about what happens when one particular particle hits another, things like this. And extrapolation to real-world situations, like the set of physical particles that constitute you or me, is, to put it politely, a bit of a leap. And in fact, if you actually want to look at the beginning of that leap, there's, I put up a picture of Nancy Cartwright's 1983 book, which has a lot, is a classic in this sort of discussion, and she shows how it's problematic even to look at the relation between, at the additivity of the simplest physical laws applied to the simplest systems. So kind of even at the very lowest levels where people thought they knew how to do this kind of building up from a complete physics to the rest of the world, that's arguably impossible. And I would also note, finally, that modern physics really doesn't look anything like billiard ball physics. It's indeterministic, the things that nobody understands, like wave-particle duality and so on. And so maybe wave billiard ball dynamics would be very difficult to make sense of. Okay, so as I said, I did have a sort of metaphysical view when I started on this. And basically the view was the world presents us with these disunified sciences, which are very successful accounts of large-scale phenomena. And these provide, given some of this metaphysical background I've been going into, good reason for thinking we don't live in the billiard ball world. And sort of, I have this very crude summary of an argument that I think is probably there. So the billiard ball world implies unified science, not unified science, therefore not billiard ball world, and the kind of symbolism of simple propositional logic. Not a terribly compelling argument, but I think maybe I'll spell it out and kind of with a few footnotes and things, I probably still think it's true. I mean, sound, let's say. But I want to mention a couple of objections to this. And one is just, of course, the idea that a lot of people say, well, you just can't infer your metaphysics from empirical science. And of course, I agree it's risky to do so because empirical science changes all the time and your empirical claims may be wrong. But I want to claim you have to try if you're going to try and do metaphysics. And as I argue throughout this, it's important to try and do metaphysics. It's important for science to have a general view of what the world is like. A second one is slightly more perhaps interesting. And this is, I mean, I've very often heard people say, this is bizarre, because surely there is only one world. So when I say, well, the world of biology is not reducible to the world of physics, well, do you mean there are all these different worlds that somehow exist side by side or on top of one another in a heap or something? And so ultimately, given there's only one world, what you say about one part of it has to be commensurable in some appropriate way with all the other parts, and in particular with the part of physics, which after all is everywhere. Everything is made of physical stuff, so surely the physical stuff has to really determine what happens at these higher levels. Now, of course, probably, yes, I think this is just billiard ball metaphysics. But at the time, I don't really just felt frustrated by this response because it just seemed, what's it mean? There's only one world and so on. But I think there's a much better reply, and that is to develop a better metaphysics in which the world is one, as it should be, but this clearly is not only consistent with, but leads you to expect incommensurable sciences at different levels of organization. And so this is what I now turn to, moving from abuse to something which I take to be actually constructive. Okay, so part 3, the true world, the disordered world, or the chaotic world with islands of partial order. So, and sorry, this is, I think, one of the nice things about a talk like this, or like this talk that this is a run for, is you're allowed to do lots of self-promotion and put up all the books you like best. This is a book that I edited with Dan Nicholson, I mentioned earlier, which came out of an ERC project on process biology. And here's basically what we say, many collaborators say more or less agree with, that actually the default state of the world is largely disordered flux. And by the way, I'm not saying that all the people who were kind enough to contribute to this book would necessarily go along with everything I say here. So in this world, patterns with some degree of causal order may emerge, and under appropriate circumstances do emerge. These are what I call persistent processes. And the metaphor here that, or the example here, which I think is always pivotal, is eddies. Think of the way a flowing stream, a somewhat turbulent stream, forms entirely stable patterns. But the stability is just the consequence of all kinds of motions around them. Think of the red spot on Jupiter, which looks like a thing that's been sitting there for hundreds of years, but is actually just essentially the very large eye of a very big storm. So that persistence may depend, and certainly will depend on capacities of their parts, but also, and this is a crucial point, on aspects of their embedding in larger systems. So this is a huge diversion from the billiard ball world, in which everything is essentially bottom up. Everything is, the goal is always to explain things in terms of their structure. I don't know if even talk about this, but a very prominent view in contemporary sort of metaphysics and science is mechanism, which says everything is, that we're interested in at any rate, is some kind of a mechanism. And mechanisms are understood by looking at the parts, seeing how they interact, seeing how the behavior of the whole emerges from the interactions of the parts. This process world is bottom up and top down equally. And there is no uniform order of the kind that is expressed in the exclusion argument that motivates reduction, supervenience, determinism, epiphenomenalism, all these famous isms from the history of metaphysics. Okay, so just to kind of get us a quick unambitious slides on the history of the universe. So just to give some sense how it works. So I think current cosmology is a history of how various stable forms arose after the Big Bang. And I don't know whether these are currently quite up to date, but it's rather wonderful stuff. It's first quarks and gluons apparently at about 10 to the minus 32 seconds after the Big Bang, which I guess was a long time then, up to through various different chemical, physical, eventually astronomical objects that start to appear. And what we need to understand this history, I think, is just the idea of temporally stable structures with capacities to combine into larger temporally stable structures. It doesn't say anything about why they combine or why they're stable. And of course, I don't mean that scientists don't have anything to say about those. I'm saying we don't need to make any assumption about those just to spell out this history. But I'm not going to, that's just a little aside. What I'm really interested in is life and the metaphysics of life, or the metaphysics of biology, as I slightly less contentiously put it in another book I'm advertising. This one's a very little book. So life, I think, and here, in a sense, I'm moving back to the empirical basis of the metaphysics and just show that looking at life fits very clearly with this flux view, because life, it seems to me, is evidently composed of temporally stabilized structures that somehow come out of a flux of activity, in this case biological, but also chemical and physical activity. And I very quickly, and some of you, or quite a few of you will have heard me say this more than once, I think there are at least three compelling reasons for treating life as a process in this sense, and living systems as eddies, more or less stable structures within this flow of activity. And just to reiterate something which is crucial, particularly when I finally come to a few suggestions about consequences of all this, there's a crucial difference from standard views is that it is often the persistence that we need to explain rather than changes to these persistent structures. I'm not saying we don't explain changes, but it's often more central to explain persistence. Okay, so just very quickly, here's three, I think each is a sufficient argument. Together, they're overwhelming for thinking of life as processes. So a very familiar fact, organisms are thermodynamically open systems, far from equilibrium. Biologists have said this for many decades. But this implies that they are neither independent, they require constant input from the environment, nor certainly stable by default, because trillions of things happen every second in your body that maintain your stability. If nothing were happening, you would be dead. And very soon you would be going down a different path of processual change. So the more or less stable individual explains activity explains the stability of the individual. prior to any explanation by that stable individual of any activity. Okay, so secondly, organisms are developmental processes, and one thing that again distinguishes them from the very brief summary I gave of the kind of things in a billiard ball world is that actually they just don't have constant properties. I mean, if somebody asks you to describe a frog, you'd probably describe something like this, but you could perfectly well describe something like this, because that's as much a frog as the thing with the four legs. A frog is a series of changes that go on through time. A frog, I'll say, is a life cycle. It's not any particular stage. We just happen to be, often more interested, or certainly as kind of non-scientists would tend to be more interested in particular stages. But organisms have a wonderful diversity of different life cycles. And to understand what the organism is and how these cycles not only persist, but keep reproducing themselves, we have to be aware that they're not just, this thing like that doesn't produce another frog except by virtue of going through the life cycle, which includes a lot of these things, which then go through a life cycle and produce another frog. So, I mean, the most elementary understanding of what the thing is requires that you look at a life cycle rather than any particular stage. So this is, I guess, is the crucial point. When we looked at things were understood. I can mention essentialism here. Traditionally, they've been understood as persisting by realizing some essential properties, but you don't need to go that far. They persist by realizing some properties, or actually no properties of an organism that need be constant throughout its life cycle. And this is one kind of very interesting process that organisms happen to exemplify. Finally, oh dear, lost all the pictures. Symbiosis, and this addresses the question of the independence of things or substances in the billiard ball world. There should be pictures of these things, which would be nice, but they're not necessary. Lots of possible examples. Almost any biological system is an example. Organisms, far from being autonomous, depend on so many interactions with other organisms, but actually there's no unique way of defining their boundaries. It depends really whether in describing me biologically, you include all the microbes on the surface of my skin as part of me, or just something that's come to sit there and interact with me, is not settled by biology or indeed metaphysics. The question is why you want to make that distinction, why you want to define me. So, summarizing, contrary to the standard conceptions of things, or as philosophers generally say, substances, few, if any, organisms are autonomous. Their boundaries can be defined in various ways, and I'd say, putting it in this general picture, the symbiotic flux is actually sort of prior, metaphysically, to the distinct biological individual. Okay, so finally, and I guess this is the point at which I want to try and respond to the philosophers of science, philosophers of biology, who are inclined to say, yeah, if you say so, but does it actually have any relevance to biology? And if not, why do I care? Or I probably don't care. So I just want to give some very brief kind of suggestions of some points where I think this actually does have quite a lot of application. So let me start off with medicine. There's a picture or two there too. I'm sorry about the technological breakdown. So I think a common conception of medicine is that it's a kind of search for ways to fix something, like a mechanism or a machine, which is a very common conception in the area, that's broken. If something's gone wrong, what can we do to fix it? I think from a process perspective, we should slightly, of course, we want to cure diseases when people are malfunctioning, we want to restabilize them. But the central mission of medical research, I would suggest, is rather to understand the processes that stabilize human life cycles at the various timescales, from the metabolic nanoseconds to the decades that we hope to live, and develop interventions that maintain, fortify, or restore these processes. But the first thing is to understand the stability. I'm really very impressed. Somebody had it probably, I have no idea whether it's true, but telling me that in traditional Chinese medicine, you pay your doctor as long as you're well. As soon as you get sick, so you no longer pay them until you're well again. It seems exactly how it should be, that the object of medicine, being to stabilize you, maintain your health. And I think cancer is my favorite kind of illustration of this. So I want to suggest that cancer is fairly obviously a process, and in a sense, the crucial thing that I want to suggest is that really the question we should ask is not so much why we get cancer as why we so often don't get cancer. So think of the organism as this amazing assembly of cells that are constantly dividing, differentiating, dying in a way that is wonderfully orchestrated to maintain a functional whole. Now, there are so many things that can go wrong with those processes of division, differentiation, and death that it's actually miraculous that the sorts of malfunctions, i.e. uncontrolled proliferation, inappropriate differentiation, failure of cells to die at the right time, doesn't happen all the time. And of course, one answer to why it doesn't is evolution. But what's evolved? All these stabilizing processes that maintain a functional whole. So I think that the first point is not to, it's incredibly unlikely that there will be a cure for cancer, as indeed, I think cancer researchers will certainly agree. They're not looking for the cure for cancer. There's a huge diversity of cancers because there's a huge diversity of ways in which this cellular organization and regulation can go wrong. And of course, there may be very important generalizations at various levels about how this happens in terms of genetic causes, external causes, and other levels of organization, physiological causes. But as I say, the unifying perspective on all of this is the attempt to understand how this whole process is ever stable. And now, I hope you've all seen Waddington diagrams of billiard balls flowing down landscapes with talking paths. Obviously, they should be here as a reminder. I just want to refer to these as the really interesting question which Waddington pioneered, attempts to answer to, of representing process in biology. And interestingly, non-coincidentally, of course, Waddington was greatly influenced by Alfred North Whitehead, the most famous 20th century process philosopher. And he collaborated actually with a distinguished artist, John Piper, who produced these famous images that you can't see on the screen. This is, I think, a very general, wonderful model for what he called a homeoretic process. A process like the life cycle of an organism, which is stabilized along a certain trajectory over time. It also shows that there are different paths that it can take. So if, for example, you think of this as a cell fate picture, then cells can go off at different points and go down a different part of the landscape. So, so I think this is and I think I won't go into the lower image, the one some of you will know with the tent pegs, which is an early description of epigenetics. I don't really think I can do this without a picture. So, and I partly introduced this because a project that has been very great deal of fun and I think very interesting that I've been involved with for the last few years with an artist, Gemma Anderson, and a cell biologist here, James Wakefield, has been actually trying to understand how you would draw, present images of that had a processual look rather than the static snapshots of processes that we traditionally do draw. And there are actually two parts of this. One is less relevant to this, but it has so much is actually the process of drawing is really interesting and productive in the process of thinking about what these entities are and what they're like. But also the process comes up with some really bizarre, but actually in the end, really interesting ways of representing this. And if you want to know why this is a picture of mitosis, I refer you to a paper at the bottom here in eLife a few years ago. Okay, so finally, and this is the very last thing I'm going to mention, but it's very much in many of our minds of late, viruses are processes. And I think that this is something that has many implications for how we should think about them. So people tend to think of viruses as something like that, which we've all seen floating about on the back of news broadcasts and so on. This is the thing that virologists call a virion, which is a part of the life cycle of a virus. It's in many ways the least interesting part because it's not doing much except just staying in its, staying more or less in its shape. It's waiting to, obviously, to find a cell that it can interact with. And then when it does so, it ceases to exist as such. So the interesting part of the life cycle of a virus, there is no virion. The virion disassembles itself, its genetic material interacts with the genes of the host cell and co-opts the mechanism to make processes that then reconstruct virions that then go out into the world to sit around on door handles and wait for the next sucker to come by and take them on board. But there is actually no unique entity for this reason. And the virus is a particularly nice example because there really isn't a thing at all for a crucial part of its life cycle. So the virus is clearly a process. I've actually, I'll only just allude to this, but done a couple of well, a few things talking about how this might change the way we think about viruses if we really took this more seriously. So if we just think of a flow of DNA and other stuff passing through organisms and sometimes sticking, this can change the way we think about these things. So we think of them as parts of larger symbiotic systems, also make sense of the growing realization that most viruses, far from being horrible things that kill us, are actually essential collaborative parts of complex biological processes. They're parts of the stabilization of those processes, for example, by regulating the population of bacteria that we have all gradually come to know as being essential for our stability. And I guess another point is that I think is very interesting here is the attention to the flow of virus generally through a host. And lets us to focus on things like the variability of viral genomes. So we tend to think, yeah, there's lots of different kinds of COVID, say, epsilon, whatever, something 5, or whatever it is that's going around now, or was going around last month before whatever's happening now. But of course, that's just an abstraction from a flow of very diverse viruses. And even when you're infected, you're part of a flow of very diverse, there's a flow of very diverse viruses passing through you. And it actually may be that the variability is a crucial factor of what happens to you. That if it's not variable enough from the virus's point of view, your immune system will deal with it fairly easily. If it's too variable, it will become unsustainable, and you again will be okay. But there's a sweet spot for the virus, so the right amount of variability, it will do nasty things to you. And I just think that all of this this is, of course, is not, I'm not saying here that this is the sort of thing that I thought of off the top of my head, because I think this is processes. I'm referring here to, to scientific work, but this is scientific work that I think looks much more salient if you start with this process view. And actually, a paper, last citation that recently I wrote with Sabina, talks about how generally one might draw messages for an epistemology based on a process perspective. And I think that's, I should say perhaps also that this is another part of this general skeptical view that I get from a lot of my colleagues, is say, okay, I sort of said this more or less before, but we've got a process metaphysics. Now can we have a process epistemology, or we'll go do something useful? Okay, so finally, nice of time. So conclusions, and I think this is just a summary. Our thinking about life, I say, is hampered by its groundings in an insufficiently rejected, though increasingly obsolete view coming from the scientific revolution, that eternal things basically pushing and pulling one another is what the world is made of, and these come together to form mechanisms, and if enough of them come together, they form mechanisms like us. I say that the proper way of understanding the disordered world that we increasingly recognize in our science is this account of a process ontology, a world of chaotic flux in which little pockets of order emerge from time to time. So I haven't actually mentioned promiscuous realism. This was a name I gave to the kind of early version of this metaphysics in my 1993 book. Was generally, I think, originally sort of a synchronic thesis. It was a thesis about the diversity of kinds of entities that we found at the time, and the diversity being such that a kind of unified science seemed incredible and implausible. But I think that the way to make this compatible, this disunified science, with one world, as it were, is to move to a synchronic thesis, of which this is just a cross-section, sorry, to a diachronic thesis, bring time into it and see that in a disordered processual world, this is the kind of, this sort of disunity, this synchronic disunity is just what you expect. Uncontroversially in many ways, but central to this view is the view of life as hard-won, constantly maintained moment of structure and stability that emerges from this kind of ocean of direction, this activity. And you may not believe my conclusions, but I hope to have shown at least that science and metaphysics interact with one another in interesting, possibly even productive ways. So, thank you very much.